They say words fade, but some refuse to die. Across America, inside rotting motels, collapsed churches and forgotten tunnels, messages keep showing up, written in chalk, painted in blood, carved into walls no one should have reached. They speak in dates that haven't happened yet. They answer questions no one ever asked aloud. Who left them? And why do they seem to know who's reading? These weren't warnings, they were instructions. Lock your doors, put on your headphones, because after this video, you'll never read a message the same way again. The chalk words in the desert motel. Amboy sits in the dead center of the Mojave Desert, a town long erased from maps, surviving only as a ghost stop along old Route 66. By 2003, almost every building was empty. That's when a small documentary crew stopped for the night at a crumbling roadside motel known as Roy's Rooms. The motel had been closed since 1989, yet when they forced open the lobby door, the dust stopped halfway across the floor, like something had disturbed it recently. Inside, the walls were covered in chalk. Words, sentences, symbols, dozens of them written over every surface, door frames, mirrors, even the inside of drawers. Each line looked like part of a diary. Still awake, he's outside again. Don't answer if he knocks. The chalk was fresh, soft to the touch, still leaving residue on their fingers. But the message that stopped them cold was the one scrawled behind the front desk. Check-in time, 12:04 a.m., August 5th, 2003. That was the exact date and time written on their camcorder's timestamp. They recorded everything, moving from room to room. The handwriting changed, sharp, then childlike, then small and deliberate, but always ended with the same phrase, "He's still outside." When the crew stepped back out into the night, they noticed footprints in the dust, their own, and one more set leading around the side of the building. They followed the prints to the last room on the end, docker ajar. Inside, nothing but more chalk on the walls. Only this time the words were written upside down. They packed up and left before dawn. The footage, later reviewed for the film, contained a final frame none of them remembered recording. The empty hallway, camera facing the front desk. On the counter, faint white letters spelled out a new message that hadn't been there before. "Come back when you can see him." The building was demolished in 2009, but when construction crews broke the foundation, they found fresh chalk dust layered beneath the concrete, sealed since the day it was poured. No one's sure who wrote those words, or how they kept rewriting themselves. But in Amboy, people still say you can hear tapping on the motel windows when you pass at midnight, like someone inside is asking if you've read the message yet, because some walls don't echo, they reply. The cassette inside the church. The church had been silent for decades. Once called St. Paul's Revival Chapel, it sat half-buried in snow and dust on the south side of Gary, Indiana, a place where entire blocks had emptied, leaving only brick shells behind. In February of 1999, 3 urban explorers entered the chapel to photograph the collapsing roof. The air was so still that every step echoed through the nave. Near the altar, under a layer of plaster, one of them found a small box wrapped in moldy cloth. Inside was a cassette tape labeled in faded ink. "Service, do not erase." They took it home, cleaned the reels, and pressed play. At first, it was ordinary. The voice of a preacher, calm, steady, reading from the book of Job. But after a few minutes, something strange began to happen. The preacher started answering questions, not rhetorical ones, specific questions. What does it mean when the roof gives way? Will anyone ever find this? Do you still hear the bells? The explorers froze. Those were the exact questions they'd been whispering while they filmed inside the church earlier that day. The tape continued, his tone patient. "Yes, I hear them. You're not supposed to be here after the bells stop." At 4:26 on the recording, a sound like static filled the speaker. Then layered under it, the faint murmur of 3 voices, not the preacher's, theirs. Their own voices, distorted, echoing back words they hadn't spoken yet. When they checked the cassette again, the label had changed. The ink had bled, now reading, "Service continues." Audio specialists later confirmed that the recording wasn't dubbed. It was continuous, without splicing. The church itself had no electrical power for years. Still, when authorities revisited the site in 2001, the sound of a low hum could be heard through the floorboards, faint but rhythmic, matching the frequency of a human heartbeat. The building was condemned and sealed, but locals who pass by the ruins at night say the chapel lights up briefly, not with flame or electricity, but with a pale glow that flickers in time with a voice. Those who've listened closely swear the preacher's last words were meant for whoever pressed play. "You came to record me, but I was already recording you," because some sermons never end. They just wait for their congregation to return. The notebook from the tunnel beneath Fort Worden. Fort Worden was built to defend the Puget Sound, a fortress of concrete tunnels and rusted artillery, later abandoned and left for moss and silence. By the 1980s, it had become a playground for history buffs and local explorers. That's when the notebook appeared. In 1984, a maintenance worker clearing debris from one of the sealed tunnels found a leather-bound book wedged behind a ventilation grate. The paper was intact, no mold, no decay. Inside were dozens of handwritten entries, all dated from 1943 to 1951. The author signed every page with the same name, Ansigny Harlan. The first entries were mundane: watch rotations, weather notes, artillery drills. Then halfway through, the handwriting changed, sharper, faster, uneven, as if written in darkness. "It's louder every night. The walls breathe when we sleep. I can see light behind the concrete. It blinks when we stop moving. They said we'd be sealed in for 1 week. It's been months." The final dated entry was May 10, 1951. After that, the pages went blank. The notebook was archived and forgotten until 2014, when a restoration team reopened the same tunnel. Near the old ventilation shaft, they found something impossible: a second notebook, identical in size and binding, same name, same handwriting. But this one was written in blue ink, a pigment not available until the late 1960s, and the new entries referenced the old ones. "Found my book again. The ink hasn't dried. They sealed the wrong side. If anyone finds this, time's still in the wall." Paper dating placed the new notebook's material as mid-century authentic, no modern replication. Even stranger, the last entry was time-stamped July 3, 2014, the exact day the tunnel was reopened. Investigators compared the handwriting from both books. It matched perfectly, down to microscopic pen pressure and stroke pattern, something no forger could imitate across decades. Today, the second notebook sits in a climate-controlled archive, unlisted to the public, but staff members say that sometimes, after closing, the glass display fogs from the inside and faint blue lines appear on the last page. They vanish by morning. Whoever wrote those words, soldier, survivor, echo, might never have left Fort Worden at all. Maybe he's still writing, one layer of time beneath ours, because some walls don't just hold sound. They hold memory, and it keeps adding pages. The numbers painted on the barn doors. It started with paint. In the fall of 1977, a local inspector traveling through Harlan County reported something unusual: a cluster of barns along an abandoned mining road, each marked with a single number in thick black paint. No two numbers repeated. No one admitted to painting them. There were 23 barns in total, scattered across 8 miles. Each number was written in the same bold hand, roughly 6 feet high, always on the doors, always facing east. The property owners assumed vandalism, but when officials ran the sequence, they found a pattern. The numbers weren't random. They followed a progression, an ascending count that skipped every 7th digit. Weeks later, a record-breaking rainstorm hit the county. Landslides followed. The barns marked with numbers that weren't skipped, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all collapsed into the valley. The 7th barn, unmarked, remained standing. Locals didn't notice the connection until weeks later, when cleanup crews began cataloging damage. The pattern was exact. The numbers stopped at 23. The last barn destroyed. The rest of the valley survived. Then, months after the disaster, more barns began to appear with new black digits. This time, the numbers started over. 1 through 9. Within a year, 9 separate structures, all miles apart, burned to the ground without known cause. When questioned, one surviving farmer claimed he'd seen a man walking the fields at night with a paintbrush and a lantern. He described him as tall, silent, and barefoot. leaving no prints in the mud. The farmer shouted. The man turned, lantern light catching his face. He said it was like looking at his own reflection. The new set of numbers ended the week the fires stopped. When investigators revisited the barns decades later, they found the black paint had seeped into the wood grain, impossible to sand or cover. Under ultraviolet light, the pigment reflected faintly red like dried blood. Lab analysis identified no known dye compound. Today, those who still live in the valley say new barns stay unpainted by choice. But when heavy storms roll through the Appalachians, drivers passing on Route 421 claim they can see faint digits glowing through the rain, counting higher than before. The last documented photograph, taken by a storm chaser in 2019, shows a barn with the number 47 freshly marked on its door. There are no structures left in that area anymore, only foundations, and the count hasn't stopped. Because maybe the paint isn't marking what's already doomed. Maybe it's telling the storm where to go next. The handwritten map from the mental hospital. When Taunton State Hospital finally closed its last ward in the early 1960s, crews were sent in to remove patient files and destroy anything unsalvageable. Most rooms were empty, beds rusted, windows sealed, walls covered in graffiti from decades of neglect. Then in cell 2B of the West Wing, they found the map. It was drawn on the floor, not paper and a stone, thousands of lines etched directly into the concrete, forming corridors, staircases and chambers. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, a patient's obsession. But when architects traced the pattern, they realized the geometry matched the hospital's actual blueprint perfectly. Except for one thing, the drawing continued beyond the known foundation. A team from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health mapped the extra sections and found entire wings that didn't exist on any record, hallways looping underground, stairwells descending to blank space, and a central circle labeled in faint, deliberate letters, Room 0. No patient by that name ever existed. No door labeled with that number was ever built. But the etching in cell 2B was too precise to be imagination. Each hallway proportion matched real architectural scale, down to the inch. When demolition began, workers cracked open part of the west wall. Behind it was a narrow shaft filled with stale air and old wiring. The lead engineer dropped a flashlight down the gap. It hit something metal. They pulled up a rusted placard. Stamped on it, R0. The construction halted immediately. The shaft was sealed. The state archived the blueprints as structural anomaly, but that wasn't the end. In 1970, a new facility built over the same ground reported electrical malfunctions every night at 2:07 a.m. Lights flickering in a perfect spiral clockwise through the halls. Maintenance staff later discovered the wiring layout beneath the floors traced the same pattern as the etched map, even though the new hospital had a completely different design. Nobody knows who carved the original lines or how they matched the hidden foundation so perfectly. Some believe a former architect was committed there and kept drawing what he couldn't forget. Others think the hospital grew the way it was drawn, following blueprints written from the inside out. The map was removed in sections, preserved under glass at a state archive, but under certain lights, technicians say new scratches appear, faint, recent, like the drawing is still expanding on its own. And in the farthest corner of the last tile, a new word has been found carved in smaller letters, shaky, almost childlike. Open, because maybe Room 0 was never a place. Maybe it was an instruction. The message on the wind turbine. Wind farms stretch for miles across the Tehachapi Pass, hundreds of turbines spinning against the desert sky, their shadows crawling across the sand like clock hands that never stop. In February 2018, a maintenance crew performing a standard inspection found something engraved on the base of turbine 19A. Laser etched into the white metal just above the foundation were the words, "If you hear it turn at night, don't look up." The letters were flawless, uniform depth, clean spacing, cut with industrial precision. At first, technicians assumed it was a prank by a welder, but the date stamped below stopped them cold. December 2015. The turbine wasn't installed until 2018. Records from Siemens, the manufacturer, confirmed that no external engravings were made during production, and the metal section bearing the inscription came directly from a facility in Nevada. That batch had been rolled in 2016, months after the date on the inscription. Thinking it might be a serial mismatch, the crew photographed the anomaly and sent it to headquarters. The file never arrived. The email chain ends mid-transfer, and the attachments remain corrupted. The next week, the same crew returned to the site. Turbine 19A was silent. The blades were perfectly still, locked in place even as the wind around them roared. When they powered down the grid to inspect the generator, every monitoring device in a 1-mile radius recorded the same frequency spike, 19 Hz, the exact resonance known to cause visual hallucinations in humans. And in that moment, the crew reported hearing a faint voice carried by the wind, repeating one phrase in a whisper stretched thin, "Don't look up." The turbine restarted on its own hours later. No fault found. By 2020, the company had replaced every base plate in the field, all except one, 19A, which engineers refused to move. They said the metal didn't sound right. When tapped, it rang, not hollow like steel, but resonant like struck glass. A private investigator later tested the plate using infrared scanning. Hidden beneath the paint were faint outlines, other words etched and erased, some readable, others too shallow. The clearest phrase, "It's already turning." Since then, residents nearby have reported hearing turbine noise even on still nights. The power company calls it wind resonance. Locals call it the hum. But if that message really was carved years before the turbine existed, then maybe whoever wrote it wasn't warning anyone. Maybe they were remembering, because some instructions don't come from the future or the past. They come from something turning between them. 6 messages, 6 voices that refuse to stay buried. Chalk on the walls of a desert motel, spelling out thoughts no one admitted writing. A cassette that spoke to its listeners 20 years too late. A notebook that kept updating itself from inside a sealed tunnel. Numbers that counted lives before the disasters began. A map that drew corridors no blueprint ever knew. And a warning carved into steel, years before the steel was made. They weren't confessions, they weren't cries for help. Each one felt like an echo sent forward in time, waiting for the right pair of eyes to read it. Someone left these words behind, knowing they would be found. Maybe messages don't travel through space, they travel through attention. Every time a new person reads them, they wake up again. And maybe that's why some places still whisper your name when you leave, because now you're part of the sentence. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a like if one of these stories stayed with you. Tell us which message haunted you most and which one you think was written for you. But remember, not every message is meant to be read. Some are still being written, right now.